Hi everybody, it's Cassidy, Mimic of Modes. I started this YouTube channel months ago, but I've been really lax about actually making videos for it. But we're far enough into the coronavirus that I'm ready to work on getting into YouTube. It's hard for me because I'm not really used to watching myself, except that I am getting more used to watching myself due to all those Zoom meetings at work. Please tell me that other people obsess about how they look, even though they know nobody's actually watching their little square because everybody else is looking at themselves or whoever's talking. So what I'm going to try to do to get more familiar with this whole format is to adapt some of my posts from Ask Historians into videos, which in theory should work a lot better than trying to do podcasts about fashion history, like I was trying to do for a while, and thank you to everybody who supported that venture. Since I can add in visual aids, which are pretty important to this subject. Ask Historians is a forum on Reddit where people can come in and ask questions about any aspect of human history, and while they're not guaranteed answers, they are guaranteed that answers they do get will be informed and based on academic sources and real expertise. I'm part of the moderation team there, and I also write answers. At first I was just writing about fashion history, but I've since branched out into social history and women's history, mainly in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. And along the way I also started focusing on queens and aristocratic women from the Middle Ages all the way up to, the mid-20th century. You can find a link to Ask Historians in the description below, and there's also one that will take you directly to my profile page, which will show you almost every question that I've answered, sorted by date and topic. So the following is adapted from a post I wrote on Ask Historians to explain how we do fashion history, what we call methodology. It's worth discussing because it's not the same as forms of history that just focus on text, or just focus on images, or just focus on artifacts. We can use all three to learn about how people dressed and how they thought about their clothing, particularly in the West. And it's important to add that last qualifier because very often we'll talk about 18th century fashion or 1920s fashion, for instance, without specifying that same clothes were not being worn globally. And if you go back far enough, they weren't even necessarily being worn all over Europe. I study Western fashion history, and when you go back a couple of centuries, I have to admit that I study English and French fashion history above all, like most American and British fashion historians. On to methodology. Primary textual and visual sources are applicable to every type of history, including this one. Primary sources are texts or images made during the time period that you're studying. Some important ones in fashion history are diaries, newspaper articles, fashion plates, portraits, and that kind of thing. These are really useful for obvious reasons, but it's so important to use them critically. You have to learn to be aware that artists might change details of the clothing being worn by a sitter, for instance. And at the same time, it's important to learn specifically how they tended to change details. If you just assume that anything you want to see is realistic and anything that doesn't fit your notions of clothing from the period is artistic license, you're not going to get everything that you could out of looking at these images. You're just confirming your own preconceptions.
In the 17th century, European writers began to deliberately create records of contemporary fashion or regional dress. Technically, the first known is from 1590, Cesare Vecellio's Degli abiti antichi e moderni di diversi parti del mondo, on antique and modern clothes of many parts of the world. But one of the best known is the Recueil des modes de la Cour de France, collection of fashions of the French court, designed by Nicolas Arnaud and printed in 1687. This depicts the formal and informal summer and winter dress of the men and women of quality at the French court. Although this book was most likely done to give artists examples to copy rather than to spread awareness of the fashions, it was the precursor to the regularly distributed periodicals like the Galerie des Modes, and the magazines that followed it, the Magasin des Modes, and Cabinet de Mode, which were published every few weeks and sent out to subscribers in Paris and around the country in the late 18th century. Other magazines, like the English Ladies Magazine, might include one or two fashion plates with a brief description mixed in with their literary content around the same time. In the 19th century, more and more of these were published, and so we have a fairly good idea of what was fashionable where from then on. Usually, fashion magazines promised that the clothing and accessories they showed were spotted by the artist and or editor on the street, in the theater, at court, or in a dressmaker's salon. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we also have sketches by designers themselves, frequently dated. These work as a similar type of document that tie a specific style to a specific time and place. We also often use portraiture and other types of artwork when they can be dated in some way, like this one, which you can see has the year written directly on it. Many of them are very detailed and give great indications of the construction used and the material as well. Other highly useful primary sources are letters and diaries. One pro of fashion plates is that they tell us what people saw as up to date, but a con is that we don't exactly know how fast people were copying them, and we don't really know what was considered a normal variation in up-to-dateness. Personal documents give us important information about individual men's and women's experiences with their clothing, what they bought and when, issues they had with prevailing fashions, what they were making fun of as dowdy, and so on. In periods before fashion plates, and for people who weren't affluent enough to pay attention to them, we're also big fans of wills and probate inventories, which can tell us at least how many items somebody owned, and often what color and fabric they were. Of course, the downside to these textual documents is that we don't necessarily know how the clothes they describe were cut and made. In some cases, we're really lucky to have a mixture of both. An 18th century Englishwoman named Barbara Johnson was conscientious enough to create an album that documented her purchases of fabric throughout her adult life and what her dressmaker made with them. For instance, the first page, which is shown here on the left, shows us a sample of a blue silk damask she bought for half a guinea a yard in 1746, and lets us know that it was made into a petticoat. The blue printed white linen underneath it was bought in 1748 for a gown. Some pages also include contemporary illustrations or fashion plates that can help to give an idea of what these gowns looked like when they were made up. The other big type of primary source we use is, of course, actual clothing. These can range from Victorian gowns made by Parisian couturiers that are still in pristine condition to tiny fragments of wool and linen and silk excavated by archaeologists from Bronze Age dig sites. The physical garment evidence we have prior to the early modern period is mostly archaeological, little bits that survived due to the qualities of the soil they were in or being near metal jewelry and fittings, although we do have some full or nearly full garments that have survived in tombs and bogs.
As with the previous categories of evidence, there are pros and cons. Pros, one is that the clothing exists in the real world, and so we know it definitely wasn't imagined by the artist or writer, but something that could have physically been made. Another is that we can look at it really closely for information about how the fibers were spun, how they were dyed, how the pieces were stitched together, how it was made to fit the body, and so on. But there are also cons. One is that it's usually not firmly attached to a date unless it's from like an archaeological find that's been close to dateable material, or there's some family history that tie it to a specific event. And con, subsection 1, and the problem with that is that family history can be very wrong. It can be off by generations. Although, so this is to take away from it being a con, I will say that usually family history from the 1880s through the present tends to be correct most of the time. You can trust it if it says, whose wedding this was from in 1912 or so on. And the third con is that we don't know what the wearer thought about it. We don't know whether they considered this garment to be well made or to fit properly or even to be aesthetically pleasing. It could have survived because it was ugly and didn't fit, and here we are holding it up to be a good example of 19-teens fashion. So we have to be careful about coming to conclusions. A gown might be dated 1876 to 1877 by a curator who knows what she's doing and is aware that it most closely conforms to the fashions of that period, but it may actually have been made in 1878 by a person who didn't want to be or couldn't be on the bleeding edge of fashion, and then it may have been brought out for special occasions over the next several years, maybe with very, very minor updates. And a third type of source that's becoming more and more accepted is experimental archaeology, or as we can also call it, costuming and reproduction. I personally like the phrase historical recreationism because it implies the attempt to accurately recreate by using historical methods and materials without the baggage of the words reproduce or reproduction, which imply a perfect duplicate. Using the methods of inquiry that I described before, people can try to make and wear garments to see how they work and find out what can be learned by following those historic methods of weaving, dyeing, or construction. I think this is most useful when it comes to questions of why did they do that? For instance, why did dressmakers in the 1860s and 1870s sometimes put thin pads in front of the arm side at the sides of the chest? Turns out it helps smooth out wrinkles. Or how does it feel to manage a bustle, or a neck stock, or suspenders, or something like that? One great example of this is Hilary Davidson's recreation of a pelisse that is said to have been worn by Jane Austen, and I'll link to her right up below, too. The big danger to this method, however, is that it's easy to go beyond the historical methods to use modern ones. Because it just makes sense to take a dart in an ill-fitting bodice, even though they simply didn't do that in some periods, or to try to fit to a modern perception of comfort or aesthetics. And that's why it's so important when you're using these experimental methods to prove a point in fashion history, to document everything and to be able to explain why one fiber or fabric or stitch or whatever was used over another. And honestly, you have to be prepared for someone to raise a point that you missed. Thanks so much for watching. I know this is kind of a drier topic than a lot of costume videos. Next time, I hope to share with you a piece from my personal collection of antique garments. And I'll see you then. Bye!